Today on Ascend, the Great Books Podcast, we welcome back the great Dr. Pavlos Papadopoulos of Wyoming Catholic College to discuss Plato's dialogue, the Crito. The work tells us of Crito visiting his friend Socrates in prison and discussing law, politics, and piety, and most of all, why Socrates will not escape prison even if he has the opportunity to do so. We have a good conversation on Achilles and Socrates, the role of piety in the political and cosmic order, and the challenges of Athens and of a modern liberal democracy for those living a philosophic life. We'll touch a bit on how Socrates and Jesus Christ were both dangers to the political orders of their day, and end with a comment on the role of myth, the sacred stories in Plato. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you who are following along on the podcast, those who are supporting the podcast on Patreon, using our guides, engaging in the community chat. It's overwhelming. I just want to say thank you. This is a fun intellectual journey to be on with all of you. And so please know that I am incredibly grateful, and we look forward to years of studying the great books together. But today, join us for a great conversation on Plato's Crito with Dr. Pavlos Papadopoulos. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books Podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. I'm a husband, father, and serve as the Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. We are recording on a beautiful and chilly evening here in rural Oklahoma. If you are new to Ascend, the Great Books Podcast, we are a weekly podcast that helps guide you through the great books. So far, we have read Homer, Hesiod, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and now we are venturing into Plato. We have read First Alcibiades together, also Euthyphro, also Aquinas on the Euthyphro Dilemma with Dr. Prudlow, and The Apology with Father Justin Barofi, a Dominican out of the Providence College. Go check those out. You can also check us out on Twitter or X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters. You can go to thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have written guides on a lot of these works that you can use for your own studies or for your small groups. Today, we are discussing the Crito, a conversation between Socrates and his friend Crito in prison as Socrates awaits his day of execution. Today, we have a wonderful guest joining us again from Wyoming Catholic College. We have Dr. Pavlos Papadopoulos. Did I say it correctly again?
You did, again.
Again, got it. Good.
Yeah.
He is the Assistant Professor of Humanities and the Faculty Representative to the Board at Wyoming Catholic College. He holds a BA in the Liberal Arts from St. John's College and a MA and a PhD in Politics from the University of Dallas. You can check his essays out on politics, culture, and education in First Things, The American Conservative, and The American Mind, and elsewhere. Doctor, it's good to have you on the podcast again.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be back.
Yeah, no, I greatly enjoyed our conversation on the Odyssey, and I was very happy that you'd come back and kind of guide us through the Crito. Do you have any particular love for Plato?
I do, yes. I actually wound up writing my dissertation on Plato, and I get to teach him pretty often, not every semester, not every year, but pretty often here at Wyoming Catholic. I read him first in college at St. John's, and I think I was just immersed and loved it at the time without yet knowing that I was going to study him seriously later. But he raises through his dialogues in this really engaging format, he raises the most fundamental intellectual and moral questions. And I wind up teaching a lot of Aristotle as well here, and I have a great fondness for Aristotle as well. But one of the wonderful, fun things about Plato is that the dialogues are always dramatic and argumentative. So there's always an argument going along, but there's also characters and personalities whose personalities influence and texture the course of the conversation. And so the whole thing feels like a more immersive and embodied experience than other forms of philosophical writing. And so I've always had a great fondness for him. He also, through Socrates, goes to those most fundamental questions just about how we should live. And then winds up presenting to us large philosophical questions in light of that fundamental question that everyone can agree is vital. And so he Plato really drew me into philosophy, and I'm forever grateful to him for that.
Any particular work that originally kind of captured your imagination?
I can't. Well, I think the first Plato I read was the Meno. That's read pretty early in the St. John's curriculum, and I understand you'll be reading that a little bit later in this group. Um, and it's certainly, he was fascinating from the beginning. But the Gorgias, I think, just the discussion of the good and pleasure and justice as it was presented, and the nature of the soul, and the eternal punishments or rewards of the soul in the Gorgias really captured me when I was a teenager, when I read it for the first time. But I've really come to love the Republic. It's not a very original answer. It's the magnum opus. It's sort of the original, the obvious answer for his greatest work. But I've been able to teach that and study that many times over the last decade. And the thing you hear about great books is that you can read it once, it's amazing, and then you can read it a second time and you get more, and you read it a third time and get more. And I've found that to be the case with many works, but I think I found that most to be the case with the Republic. Each time it does feel like I am gaining more and more and more. And I've had the opportunity to read and teach it about a dozen times. So I actually have the track record of not just taking on faith that great books grow and develop and deepen as you return to them again and again, but actually having experienced that.
Yeah, it's amazing too how much you come to learn a text if you have to teach it. I shouldn't say have to, maybe if you have the delight to be able to teach it. And I think there's a certain mirroring there too if you read it in a group, right? If you actually
Absolutely.
try and express your ideas to others to help them or to be helped by them, it's amazing how that iron sharpens iron, and you kind of get drawn into the text, into a passage. You're like, oh yeah, I've got this, and then someone else brings up different perspectives, and it just kind of continues to somewhat unfurl for you. And that's what I feel like reading Plato again on this way, is there's these dialogues, the Apology, the Euthyphro, even this one, Crito. These were dialogues I would tell you that I was very familiar with, but now then this read through, reading them in our my Sunday Great Books group, reading them here on the podcast, it's amazing how many more insights that you kind of draw from them each time that you read, particularly if you're reading them in a group or with friends.
Certainly. And again, the form of Plato's dialogues themselves reflect that thinkers engaging with one another, or ordinary people engaging with one another, are having that experience. And then you have the opportunity to imagine yourself as one of those characters, or construct another dialogue with the dialogue that's unfolding in front of you. So,
yeah, it seems to, sometimes we have to remind ourselves, because we're so used to reading like treatises now. Like we read things like Aristotle, right? We read like instruction manuals, even though I think most of our like New York Times bestsellers are written on like a 5th grade level, but like that's what you're used to reading. Is it like a treatise? And I think we have to remind ourselves that actually it's the question answer format that's most natural to human learning. I'm like a child to a parent. And so the dialogue really mimics that, right? Mimics that natural way that we learn. And we see that some of the best texts, I mean, even the Summa, which at times can be incredibly dry, is still mimicking that kind of seminar question answer, iron sharpening iron format, which seems to be a very natural way for the mind to kind of drift and journey into truth.
Definitely.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but we typically think of, we kind of think of Socrates as this like old guy that's like harassing people in the marketplace, right? Like that's, at least that's what he gets accused of, right? That everyone in Athens is just trying to live their life and, go buy bread and do whatever else you're doing. And here's this, I guess, ugly older man that's like harassing you and be like, do you even know what it means to buy bread? Like, what does it mean to exist, right? And like this poor guy is trying to do something. But it occurs to me, as I kind of study more into Plato, is that, yes, Socrates had these conversations with his friends that we get in all of the dialogues. But there's a whole other aspect that I don't think we talk a lot about, which is Socrates gathered with his friends to read great books and to discuss them. He gathered together to read the great books of his day and to discuss it with his friends. And I think that sometimes we forget this. Like we think he's just in the marketplace harassing people. But I think that you could probably make an argument that like one of the ways that he actually taught his inner circle the most was actually sitting down and reading texts with them in friendship.
The ones that come up most frequently in Plato's dialogues, which the dialogues do not themselves purport to be perfect historical, factual transcripts of something that happened. Maybe the Apology is the closest to that. Maybe the Crito is the second closest to that, perhaps, but there is an imaginative element that Plato admits to. But the closest we come to what you're describing Socrates doing in the dialogue seems to be the engagement with the Homeric tradition and maybe also the tragedians as well. It's my suspicion, I haven't confirmed this, but I'm almost certain that it's true, that Homer is the authority, or just the text, the author quoted most often throughout the Platonic dialogues. And that's for very good reason. Homer and Hesiod together in some way are standing in the place of scripture for the ancient Athenians. They're the closest they have to an authoritative account of the nature of things, of the nature of the divine, of the human in relation to the divine, the heroes sort of standing between ordinary humans and the gods. And so the conversations themselves are peppered with allusions and sometimes direct quotations, and then sometimes direct discussions of quotations of Homer above all others. He's certainly, Plato through the dialogues is certainly engaging with other sources, and it tends to be the poets and Homer as the king of the poets. But that's an interesting comment for you to make starting out the Crito, because there is a sophisticated and very high culture already present in Athens by the time Socrates comes along. He doesn't become a philosopher ex nihilo. He doesn't simply turn himself from an ordinary person like every other person on earth at that time into the person that we know. There's a context there that is a culturally, imaginatively, to some extent, in some ways, philosophically, certainly poetically, religiously rich culture that he grows in, and so your comment to that effect makes me think, oh, that sheds light on part of the Crito, because part of what's going on in the Crito is Socrates' argument to his friend Crito that Socrates, is indebted to Athens. And we might initially think, what do you mean, Socrates? I mean, you're like no one else in Athens. You're not the typical Athenian. Athens didn't make you Socrates. Sure, Athens gave you, bread in some way and gave you security in some way, but you made yourself the philosopher Socrates. And so this is actually a question I always have with the Crito is, in what sense is Socrates obligated to Athens? Is it for just keeping body and soul together in him for 70 years, somehow enabling that? It seems like there's something much richer going on there. And what you just alluded to, that Socrates has had his own Great Books podcast or something like that in ancient Athens, is maybe a move in that direction, that there's a deeper and richer debt than even one that is directly discussed in the Crito, that Socrates is aware of. That Athens didn't just give him birth, it gave him birth and education, and it didn't give him the education ordered towards philosophy in his understanding, but the pieces in some way were there in Athenian culture, which is so indebted to Homer and the tragedians before them.
Yeah, that's something that we're going to have to look into and kind of unpack a bit, is that almost this politics of gratitude. And what is the gratitude that Socrates has towards Athens? Because it really does stand in contrast to the apology, right? There tends to be this almost antagonistic contrast in some of these previous dialogues that we've read between the great-souled man, the philosopher, and the demos, the people under the democracy. There seems to be so many antagonisms here that I think sometimes for first-time readers, the Crito can throw you for a loop, that all of a sudden, when Socrates is given an option to leave, he's like, no, I'm so indebted. I have this deep gratitude to the polis. I think that's something we're going to have to explore, because you're correct. What is it that he has received? What is it that actually has kind of cultivated in him this type of gratitude? The beginning. Let's look at the beginning, right? So Crito, he's in prison, right? Socrates is in prison, and Crito, his friend, has come to visit him. And there's this kind of little interesting thing at the beginning, in which Socrates is still alive. They haven't killed him yet. Actually, he sits in prison, I think, for up to a month before they do that. And so we get this kind of line of why is this? And so we see that they're waiting for the ship to come back from Delos. And so my understanding of this is, is that it's a religious ritual, right? That Athens has that goes all the way back to Theseus, right? Kind of their King David, their King Arthur.
Mhm.
Uh, Theseus, when he went and defeated the Minotaur. So if you remember Athens, and they had to give over these youths, they had to pay tribute, and the Minotaur would eat them over in Crete. And so Theseus goes with them and defeats the Minotaur and comes back a hero and a victor. And I think one of the things he did is he prayed to Apollo, um, that, or actually, I think it's the people, maybe either him or the people prayed to Apollo, saying, "Oh, if you gain victory, like we'll continue to have this sacrifice for you." So this is a religious thing. It's like almost a pilgrimage. So they have the ship, and it's blessed, and it goes off to the island of Delos, and then it comes back. And one of the oddities of the ritual is that there can't be any public executions until the ship comes back. And of course, like, this is not like today's ships. They have to rely on the wind. It might get delayed. All kinds of things that can happen. So Socrates is sitting here for up to a month, and this has now allowed for him to have further dialogues, with his friends. But I think for those of us who are coming to understand how to read Plato, as you said earlier, I think you said an imaginative. I would say there's a pedagogical veneer on the dialogues. They're not just simply a transcript. Plato's trying to teach us things. What is happening here? I mean, any thoughts on, like, why do we have this myth? Why does Plato give us this myth as a beginning, and how does it play into Socrates the philosopher, awaiting his execution?
Yeah, that's great. I feel like there's a lot going on in these first few pages, even before the mention of the ship. But I think something in the first line itself ties in with that, with the ship returning from Delos. So the ship returning from Delos is in gratitude for the Athenians ages ago being freed from this kind of tyranny from Crete, in the form of the Minotaur, and having to send their youth and so on. Who's Minos? Minos he appears in other Platonic dialogues, including the Gorgias, as a judge in the underworld. He's a sort of godly figure who is credited by the Cretans as being the divine founder of their own political order. Maybe in the way that Romulus is kind of like the divine founder of Rome, though he's a man who becomes a god. There's something somewhat analogous to that. Minos, or maybe Minos is standing in as God in relation to Moses or something like that. He's the divine source of law and justice, and so Minos appears as a embodiment of divine justice, and then yet you have in the course of Cretan history in relation to Athens, you have this terrible monster emerge, and you have the Minotaur, and there's this horrible perversion of justice, and Athens is suffering. Why do I mention all this? Because the very first line, these like first few lines of the dialogue, it seems like it's just window dressing. They start up the conversation like Crito's in the jail cell really early. What's going on with that? Okay, he bribed the judges. That seems to be what's happening here. But the very first thing that Socrates says, he says, "Why have you arrived at this hour, Crito? Or isn't it still early?" Crito's own name is related to the Greek word for judgment or judge. And so it's almost as if the first line of the dialogue is, "Hey, Justice, why are you here early? You're actually here too early. You're the executioner," even though that's not who Crito is, but his name conveys judgment is coming for Socrates earlier than expected. It's not yet daybreak even. And that's odd, because it's in fact, as you pointed out, it has in fact been a delay, because of this convention with the ship going and coming back. And so from the beginning, just through those two dramatic moments in the first few pages, Plato's raising the question, is Socrates being executed prematurely? Is there something unjust and sudden and unwarranted about this? Or is he in fact in a position of gratitude towards coincidence, or maybe it's providence, that his execution sentence came when the ship was absent, and so he has another month to live, and in fact he should be in a posture of gratitude to the gratuity of the gods or the city or whatever it is that has given him even more life and time than he deserves. So right there, I think that's an example of Plato using the literary devices of the dialogue to raise the dialectical question, the logical question of the dialogue, which is has Socrates lived too long, or has he lived not long enough? Has he actually exhausted life, and does he deserve to die for corrupting the youth, or is he in fact should he just be grateful for every single day that he's received on this earth and in this city?
No, I like that a lot. Thank you for drawing the attention to the first line, which is probably something that we should always do when reading Plato. So maybe to kind of build upon what you said, just a few things that occurred to me. One, it's a religious festival to Apollo. And so, we could draw all kinds of connections there. Apollo, particularly in the Oracle of Delphi, seems to be the only Olympian god that Plato or Plato's Socrates ever seems to give any kind of credence to. So it's a feast to Apollo, the god of light, that is actually delaying his execution. I think one might be able to push into that a bit. I'm also curious, this is kind of a raw thought. I'm curious here, the relationship between poetry and philosophy. We saw this so clearly in the Apology. His main accuser is a poet. And the poets and the philosophers are kind of vying against each other to be the teachers of the people. Who are the actual teachers of the people? And they're antagonistic towards one another to a certain degree, even though I think Socrates, to borrow a phrase, tries to baptize poetry in a lot of ways. I don't think he's against poetry per se, but rather a poetry that can be submissive to philosophy and teach what's actually true. So here what's really interesting to me is, they vie for the polis, and here's the polis basically under a religious myth, right? That the poets have given them. And so you can kind of really maybe ask, like, what is dominant in the polis? And what do we have? Well, we have a polis that is highly referential to the poetics, to this like religious myth, while the philosopher is in prison awaiting his execution. If you look at its face, like, which one is actually dominative in the polis? Well, it seems that poetry is winning. It's the one that sets the rhythm of life. It's the one that sets the rules and customs and rituals. Meanwhile, philosophy is down in the dark prison. So I wonder if there's things in contrast that can be drawn out there.
Yeah, I really like that way of framing it. I think you're right about that. And of course, the surprising thing is that the philosopher uses some kind of philosophy to justify his own execution in the course of this dialogue. So that's not what you may have expected, right? You may have expected him to use his philosophic power somehow channeled into, because there's this striking contrast with the Apology where Socrates says, I'm not the guy who gives great speeches. And then he gives a great speech in here to persuade Crito to not liberate him. But yeah, it seems like actually there's another connection with the Apology which might be worth mentioning in relation to what you just pointed out about this struggle between poetry and philosophy, and the fact that Socrates and certainly Plato do not simply reject poetry despite some appearances. In the Apology, there's a striking moment when Socrates is temporarily accepting the possibility of paying a great fine instead of, before he's actually given the death sentence. And he says, I don't have much money, but I'll give you the money that I have. And also he mentions that his friends in the audience are speaking up and saying that they'll sort of pledge their own wealth, which is considerable, on his behalf, so that he's good for the money. He's good for a great deal of money because several members of the audience are very wealthy and are his friends. And I think he mentions 4 names, but Plato and Crito are among the 2 of them. This is really striking because Plato does not insert himself into the dialogues. There's another place where he's mentioned because of relatives and so on in the Platonic corpus, but he doesn't put himself as a character in the dialogues at all. The only place where Plato, does anything in the dialogues is in that passage in the Apology where Socrates reports that Plato will help pay for this fine on behalf of Socrates. And and when we get to the Crito, we think, okay, Crito is a man, he seems to be of considerable wealth. He's able to bribe the guards here and there. He's able to give Socrates a home in Thessaly, and everything's going to be taken care of because he can pay his way through anything. What is Plato's way of paying for Socrates? What can Plato actually do to secure Socrates? my own theory on that, and the way to read that passage in the Apology, is that Plato's payment on behalf of Socrates is to create a poetry memorializing, almost an epic poetry memorializing Socrates as philosopher. And so Plato's great payment is not actually gold or silver or anything like that, so that Socrates won't be executed. It's to write these dialogues, and that's his way, which is, it turns out, is a much superior way to what someone like Crito can do, or really any of us could do. Is that Plato is able to, as he says in one of his letters, make Socrates beautiful and young and present him in that form. And that's the ultimate apology. The ultimate defense of Socrates is the whole Platonic corpus, all of the dialogues, where, as Socrates says in the Apology, look, I'm not going to be able to justify myself to all of you, all 500 and whatever of you Athenians, in this context. You're prejudiced against me. I'm not a lawyer, etc. But what we can do is we can follow Plato and see Socrates' life imaginatively reenacted with attention to his core activity, which is philosophizing. And that becomes a kind of new poetry, which stands as a real rival to the heroism that's at the center of the epic and tragic and maybe comedic poems of the time as well. You've got a new epic, a new poetic hero who happens to be a philosopher, and then you've got the poems or the dialogues in which you get to see the drama of Socrates' own heroic quest, which is for wisdom rather than for glory or something.
That's beautiful. I like that a lot. I mean, let's maybe push into that more, because I think it serves as a good segue. Because if that is, because I agree, Plato is offering us poetics. I mean, that's one of the things that, like, if you read the Republic, some people walk away saying, like, see, Plato doesn't like poetics. He doesn't like the poets. And it's like, well, how did you know this? You read what? A dialogue. You read a drama. So he provides a certain poetry, and not only in dialogue, but then we get, just think of the Republic, you have Gyges' Ring, you have the cave allegory, you have the myth of constantly using myths, stories, etc., to express these things. But I thought what you said was really fascinating, of like a new epic, a new heroism, because we have, maybe that gives us a little context, because we continually get from Plato allusions or comparisons or juxtapositions between Achilles and Socrates. We saw this almost comedically in the Apology, right, where Socrates himself compares himself to Achilles in not having a fear of death. This was something that when he talks about Patroclus and etc. Here, though, to push into the text a little bit, here, like, what is this, like 44A, 44B, we get this narrative of a dream, very short narrative. We get, a woman, Socrates says, a woman came to me, and she basically said, in 3 days, right, Socrates, may you arrive at fertile Pythia on the 3rd day. And so basically just a few high-level things. One, so he's saying, I know when I'm going to die. I've been told by this kind of divine messenger. One, I'd like to know who she is. What does she represent? Like, who is this kind of mysterious female character? Two, we get another, this is an allusion to the Iliad. So just to give some context, if you remember during our year with Homer and we read the Iliad, Achilles is given 2 fates. He has to choose. One of them is to go back home, right, to a life of peace, a life of family, but of obscurity. He doesn't have the kleos. He doesn't get the glory, but it's home to Pythia. He can return home to this. However, his other choice, his other fate, is to die in Troy, because then he gets eternal glory out of this death. And obviously he chooses to stay and fight in Troy. So here then we have another allusion, another comparison between Socrates and Achilles. So what is happening? Like, what is this dream supposed to be teaching us?
Yeah, that's wonderful, and all of those allusions that you just mentioned to the Homeric stories and the Homeric heroes are there. It seems like the most basic reading, which Crito's immediate response is, "This is a strange dream," and Socrates immediately denies that. He says, "No, it's pretty clear to me," which is itself odd that he sort of dismisses any mystery or something about it. But so the low hanging fruit, of course, is that he's going to die soon, right? He's returning to Phthia, and in that sense, he's there's a way in which Socrates is being called home, and his home it seems to be, is in the next life or in the realm of the divine. He develops this further in the next dialogue in the Phaedo, when he talks about the relation between the activity of philosophizing and dying. So I don't want to spoil that for your readers, but just look out for that. Maybe connect this to that discussion in the next dialogue. I don't have a thesis for the specific identity of the woman. She's a beautiful woman dressed in white. She seems to be divine in some way, and I'm not sure if we're supposed to think of a particular person beyond that. I don't have a developed theory there. But this is part. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm just kind of spinning my wheels too. I mean, just, yeah, I mean, obviously, like Lady Philosophy, obviously that's a more matured phrase. We don't get that in Plato, but you see this both in the Hebrew tradition. Philosophy is wisdom, particularly, is compared to woman. Lady Wisdom in the Old Testament literature. We have Lady Philosophy in Boethius. It's hard not to think of the Symposium with Eros and erotic love. The way that he talks
and
about
with the priestess, and
with Diotima, right?
Yeah.
The priestess, that the fact that this, the beloved can kind of open your eyes, can actually kind of launch you on the ladder of love and your ascent towards the divine beauty itself. I mean, there's a lot of things I feel like you can kind of connect it to. I even tried to do a little bit of research to see if he ever contextualized his daemon in like a female context. It doesn't seem that he ever did. He does talk about the god talking to him in dreams. It is one of the ways that he says that the god speaks to him. It's not entirely clear it's the daemon that does anything, because usually the daemon just checks. It doesn't say positive things. This is a positive thing that this messenger is saying, which doesn't seem to be the role of his daemon. So yeah, it's just, I don't have a developed theory either, but I just wanted to just maybe parse some things out real fast, because it's just a fascinating character, right? And yeah, you're right. He's just like, yeah, it's not weird, and then just moves on. You're like, well, I would like you to tell me more about this dream. I'd like to know who this female character is, but we don't get it. I don't have a strong tethering outside of maybe just some kind of personification of wisdom itself.
Just to make a few more notes on those Homeric connections, right there. The Homeric equivalent might be Thetis, right? Who's the mother, right, of Achilles. And so there's actually a kind of return home element, which maybe we should keep that in mind when we get later into this dialogue, because the city is presented as the fatherland, and it's compared to the father and duties to father. And so maybe he's sort of balancing out the discussion of the father there with an allusion to the mother. But the other thing happening in the Iliad in Book 9 that this seems to be referring to is when Achilles says to Odysseus that I could return to Phthia. The context for that is him saying it's the embassy scene, and it's him, Achilles, denying Odysseus's invitation to be reconciled to Agamemnon. And so if Agamemnon is the sort of unjust superior over Achilles, here it seems like, is it all of Athens is the unjust superior over Socrates? But Socrates is going to complicate that, even though that's the way that Crito might be thinking about it. That's the way that we readers might be thinking about the situation. Socrates seems to be alluding to that, and yet then going on to complicate that immediately afterwards.
Do you think it's interesting though? I really like the Thetis. I really like that a lot. I like that a lot. Do you think though? So maybe just pushing more into that. Do you think it's interesting though that it's the Pythia side of the fates that Socrates gets compared to? Because Achilles doesn't choose to return to Pythia. Achilles doesn't choose to return to Pythia, right? He chooses to die in Troy. So it's interesting here that, like, I mean, they're all analogies are analogies because they're not the same. And so, to a certain extent, you don't want to stretch them too thin. But like, does Socrates have two fates here? It seems like it, right? One is to maybe to escape, right? Maybe this is an illusion, like to escape. But what's interesting here is like for Achilles, the escape seems to go home to Pythia. Right. It's reversed. Does that make sense? For Achilles, the escape is to go home to Pythia, but he decides to die in Troy. Here with Socrates, his escape would be to go with Crito to run away, but he contextualizes staying to die not as dying in Troy, but returning to Pythia. Does that make sense? And I'm not sure entirely what to make of that.
I see exactly what you're saying, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of it either, except to say it that although it's inverted, there's a way in which Socrates is doing the Achilles thing by embracing the action that will win him immortal glory. And like Achilles, he needs the help of a poet to memorialize him, or else he's just going to die, and there's going to be no Kleos there because no one's going to know about it. And so Achilles needs a Homer, and Socrates needs a Plato, and it's by standing his ground, though that here is characterized as not returning to Pythia, or returning to Pythia rather than not. So it's inverted in that way, and yet he's somehow saying that he is achieving the kind of thing that Achilles did, though in a radically different and maybe apparently opposed way. And so maybe the meaning of that is to signify that he is achieving heroism, embodying the heroic, almost divine state through speech and contemplation, rather primarily through deeds and war. And so maybe it's his way of indicating the parallels, but also the inversion of the active life and the contemplative life, if that's how you want to describe the warrior and the philosopher.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, let's push into a little bit into Crito and his kind of argument. So this starts, let's see, when does Crito actually start? So somewhere around like 44C or so, Crito seems to start to give his arguments. I might summarize it just broadly in like two main strokes. One is, what are the majority of men going to think? Right? They're going to think like, I'm wealthy, I could have got you out of here, and he didn't. And what are they going to think about you? Like, you could have escaped. Like, so he appeals to this majority of men. What will the majority of men think about? And then, which I laughed out loud. You have to laugh out loud when you read the dialogues, but I really laughed out loud when he said this. Then down at like 45C, he says, besides Socrates, I do not think what you are doing is just. And I just laugh because, like, you might as well just set off an atom bomb in the dialogue, right? Like, and accusing Socrates himself of not being just.
You should know better. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Crito. So actually, this is actually a question I had, right? So these are kind of the two questions that I think that then Socrates around, 46B, kind of gives some more structure to Crito and says, okay, these are the two things I hear from you. The majority of men, is that an opinion that we want? Should we adhere to that? And then two, is what I'm doing just? And so these are the two questions that seem to give structure to the dialogue. One question I had, assuming you think that's a fair summary, is do we really think Crito, like, this is going to work? Like, I guess my question is this really an argument of logos? Like, you're really trying to convince Socrates? Or is this actually an argument of pathos? Are you really just trying to give him like an emotional appeal? Because these things of like, you're betraying your sons, you're choosing the easiest path, cowardice, unmanliness. Like, anyone who's been reading Socrates up to this point, like, you just have to think like none of these arguments are going to work. And so I didn't know, like, is Crito really trying to make a logical argument here, like an appeal to logos? Or is this like the one last ditch effort of like pathos, of like, I'm your friend trying to appeal? And maybe it's a mixture thereof. But the thing is, like, you have to think like, Crito, did you really think this was going to work?
I think Crito's doing the best he can. And I don't want to be cruel to him because he's really well-intentioned. And I mean, gosh, he's going out on a limb here. He's trying to do the right thing as he sees it. But let's think about the little clues that we have about who he is and his character. He's of comparable age to Socrates. They're from the same deme. They're from the same sort of neighborhood of Athens. So they've got a kind of connection. Same age. They seem to have known each other for a very, very long time. They seem to have been friends of some kind for a very long time, maybe for their whole life. But we have to keep in mind those qualifiers. Friends of some kind. Is Crito a real philosophic peer with Socrates? Is Crito like one of the young men who often flock to Socrates and are on fire with the desire to gain wisdom, or at least to show up their elders, and then that angers everyone and Socrates gets executed for it? Does he have the intellectual chops and the dedication and the focus to really pursue philosophic question in Socrates' mode over the course of the decades he's lived? It seems like no. It seems like he is someone who has been friendly with Socrates for a long time. And Socrates many times says, when we were having all of these conversations all of these years, were we serious or not? Socrates directly alludes to the fact that Crito has been a participant in, or at least present in, the kinds of dialogues that we have through Plato's writings. But he does not seem to have been the lead member, the lead interlocutor, the brightest tool in the tool shed for any of those conversations. And so in a way, Socrates is quite gentle with him. And in a way, Socrates is quite generous with him. What Socrates does in this conversation is he gives Crito, during the last days of Socrates' own life, he gives Crito an intimate opportunity to have a real Socratic conversation with Socrates. And he has to help him out a lot, but he's not just there Socrates is not just refuting Crito and then sending him on his way. He's treating him with the gentleness that is due to a friend that one has had for a very long time, even if that friend is not on the same level in the kind of activity that they're engaging in right now. So he's being quite polite, I think, to Crito, and being generous and inviting him into a proper conversation that Socrates has to do a lot of the lifting on both sides. He in fact has to create a dialogue that Crito can sort of witness and just behold, because Crito himself maybe couldn't rise to that level. But I see it as a very generous response by Socrates, which is ironic because Crito comes off initially as the generous one who's he's risking breaking the law for Socrates. He's giving all his money for Socrates. And yet Socrates seems to be paying him back by saying, no, thank you, but then also by giving him the experience of sort of taste of the philosophic life. Which in Socrates' estimation is the very best thing. And in Crito's own estimation, apparently, Crito had this sort of fuzzy idea that Socrates' life is worth living and he should keep doing the thing that he does. And so he tries to set him up in the country somewhere, even though there's all kinds of problems with that Socrates sees and he doesn't. So he has this, I think it's a very flawed argument that Crito provides. But Socrates is gentle and generous in his response to it.
Which is really amazing. I mean, imagine that you are sitting in jail unjustly. You not just got done, but you had this amazing speech that you pulled off. And then your friend shows up and says, hey, you know what? I think you should abandon everything you said. And I think you're being unjust. Like, so actually, one of the things I found too is not only is Socrates like, the overarching narrative is very generous towards Crito, but even like Socrates' initial response to him is very unmoved. It's not a response of pathos or emotion, which I think it would be for most of us. Like, how dare you, or who are you, or were you not paying attention? I wonder too then if there's like a deep care for Crito on behalf of Socrates, because to be quite frank, I'm still not sure Crito ever gets it. I think Crito makes his appeal, and then he gets sucked into a dialogue. And then I think he just stays there to listen to Socrates because he doesn't really give anything of substance the entire dialogue. Just maybe some yeses. Yes, Socrates, I agree. If you say so, whatever. And like you mentioned, this is one of the dialogues in which the interlocutor cannot keep up. Yeah. And so basically Socrates creates an interlocutor for the dialogue so these conversations can continue to move forward. So no, I agree with you. I think it's very generous. It's very kind towards Crito. And I don't know, one of the questions is, for whose benefit is this? I think while Socrates does appreciate being tested to a certain degree to make sure that what he's doing is just, it seems to be that, like the Euthyphro and like First Alcibiades, the benefit is towards the interlocutor. And I'm not really sure Crito is actually open or malleable to it. I think, at least my intuition is, once he realizes that Socrates isn't going to leave, which is pretty early in the dialogue, I think you could tell, like, this guy's not leaving. Crito doesn't seem to really engage. He's just kind of there with his friend, kind of playing it out.
Yeah, and so perhaps Crito actually understands himself to be benefiting Socrates in that situation. He's like keeping him company or something like that, right. Letting Socrates do the thing that Socrates likes to do, which is have a philosophical conversation. And yet I think you're right that ultimately it's Socrates attempting to benefit Crito. And if we think about the bigger picture of the dialogue, both back to the meaning of Crito's own name as he's a judge, and we've just seen that in the Apology, judges can get things grievously wrong. So judges need to be educated. Athenian justice needs to be educated. Crito, in some ways, just by the reference of his name, is embodying that, but maybe also in the substance of his argument that we need to care a lot about what the many think. In the context of his argument, that's he doesn't want the many to think poorly of him and Socrates. But if you keep going with that mentality, maybe the many are the ones who decide what justice is instead of the one who actually knows what it is. And so maybe the way Plato's constructed this dialogue, he's using it as an occasion to show Socrates' interest in educating the judge, the embodiment of political justice, even though that embodiment might be in some way well disposed to him, but really not understanding what he's doing or the meaning of his life or the dignity of philosophy or anything like that.
So why don't we care about what the majority of men think? Right? This is his first argument. So Socrates takes this on. He takes it on. I think he sets up the question around 47a, and then the dialogue kind of goes back and forth. So why don't we care about the majority of men? Why is that not a good standard to understand how to live our life?
Yeah, he refers to gymnastics, the doctor and the trainer. This is a clear-cut area in which there are right and wrong answers, and you need some kind of sophistication, some kind of expertise to correctly discern the right answer in medicine or in gymnastics and athletic care. It's a field of excellence in which, by definition, a few will excel, and it's a field in which Greek culture has made progress to have a somewhat systematic approach to the care of the body and the perfection of the body. And so this is a clear example of how what the man on the street or what an opinion poll will tell you about what to do in caring for your body is going to be much less reliable than what the person who has dedicated himself to learning this science will be able to tell you. And then, of course, Socrates makes the move, as he so often does in his dialogues, of, okay, if we have an expert in medicine, why don't we have an expert in the soul? Who's that? Like, if we have an expert in fitness, why don't we have an expert in justice and nobility and so on? And he here just suggests that there is such a person, and that it would be that person that we should look to, not the many, not what they happen to think. And so we should not care about their opinions of justice. We should not care about their opinions of us. The standard they're holding us to for whether we're just or unjust is an unreliable and false standard. And so we need to discern the correct standard. And he then suggests very strongly that he's already found that. And in fact, that Socrates and Crito presumably was there. He should have been following the conversations over the years, and their other friends. They know better what justice is, and they know better what we should pay attention to and what we should ignore or at least set aside.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, it is interesting that he, as he does so often, he couples and juxtaposes the body and the soul, right? Mm-hmm. So that's at 47e, he talks about the body, and then at 48a, he talks about the soul, right? Is the life worth living for us with that part of us corrupted that unjust actions harm and just actions benefit? Or do we think that the part of us, whatever it is, that is concerned with justice and injustice is inferior to the body? No, not at all. So yeah, this is a clear way that he typically thinks, right? So he gets his interlocutor to understand about what we're going to do about gymnastics or, music or something that they understand. And then he draws an analogy out to the incorruptible, right? To the soul, to the spiritual, if you want to use that. And, this falls pretty flat, right? Like, again, you're like, Crito, did you really? The guy just stood up against 500 of his countrymen, right? And basically at times critiqued them. Like, do you think he's really going to fall for a critique of like, hey, the majority will think poorly of you? I think they already do. That's why he's in this position, right? So this falls pretty quickly. And then it kind of gets into what I think is the meat of the dialogue itself, which is the accusation that Socrates, you're not acting justly. And this is, I think, to maybe defend Crito, I think this is a good argument. Or maybe we could phrase it this way, like, if you are unjustly condemned, is it unjust to escape? If you are unjustly condemned, right, you're put in prison for a clearly unjust reason. Is it not just then for you to escape? And I mean, I think maybe that's best. This is Crito's argument. It seems to make sense to a lot of people. When I read it in my Sunday small group, we had one or two people that were like, yeah, I would escape. I don't know why he's not escaping. Like, what does it matter? Why give into this? And the Catholics are thinking an unjust law is no law. Why do I need to obey this? I can leave. So I think this is a good argument. And actually now, as you mentioned earlier, we get the fascinating component of the philosopher who's unjustly in prison, awaiting his unjust execution, is going to now explain why it would be unjust for him to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of what's so striking about that, okay, so the comments around the edges of this argument, Crito's plan is, I've got a safe house for you off in Thessaly, which is not exactly as fertile ground for philosophic conversation as Athens. I mean, this is the boonies he's talking about of Greece. It's not a great cultural center like imperial Athens at the turn of the 4th century BC. It's not Socrates' home, and it's also not a place where he could where there's a orderly laws and a high culture, where he could do the thing that he lives for, which is philosophize. And so the context for this whole argument is, well, the option that Crito is giving him is actually not really consistent with Socrates' own primary concern, which is to philosophize. In addition, Socrates makes comments several times about his age. I mean, he's been around for a while. Athens gave him 70 years, and he wasn't philosophizing and stinging them like a gadfly that whole time, but it's been quite a while. And so maybe he's ready to die, right? He's had the dream that on the 3rd day he's going to be going home, and that seems to be he's going to be going to Hades, and so he's lived long enough. And so there's also that, in addition to the argument itself, I just wanted to point out there are these sort of dramatic factors that are laid around it. That it's not as simple, do you disobey the unjust law or do you obey the unjust law? It's also, Socrates is a particular man who's living in a particular place under certain conditions and has his own history. But yeah, he develops this into this is where he has to construct the dialogue with the laws of Athens, right? He has to himself become the laws and answer himself, but answer Crito's objections by saying, this is around, I'm looking now at 50 B and C, should we, Crito, tell the laws that the city was doing us injustice and did not pass judgment correctly? Shall we say this or what? And Crito gets really animated. Yes, by Zeus, Socrates. Yes, this is what we've got to say. This is his moment of greatest excitement, right? And this is what you're pointing to, that maybe the city is doing injustice, and so if it's doing injustice, then it's not just to go along with it. And his answer to this is, the laws of Athens that Socrates is channeling in this dialogue pull back the camera, right? And then they zoom out and say, think about the entirety of your existence, the entirety of who gave you that? To whom are you indebted? And it's a little bit of a strange argument to us, because we might think, well, my parents, period. But Socrates, speaking in the voice of the laws, instead says, well, yeah, your parents, because the city has marriage laws, something like that right. Your parents were married in the city according to the laws and customs and presumably the religious aspects of Athens. And so there's a way in which Athenian law was there from the beginning, at the condition for your conception, which is to say that the marriage of your parents. And also in your nurture and your education. Our city, the laws of our city, commanded your father to provide you an education in music and gymnastic. And so even though there wasn't a public school system or something like that educating you, you're still indebted to the city, because it was forming the people who are forming you. And so really you're formed by the city, ultimately. And this becomes at 50e, it seems almost excessive, because at one point he says, you, Socrates, are Athens's offspring and slave. Slave? That seems quite excessive. Offspring, I was persuaded by a little bit, but the way I understand that comment is that Socrates's debt to Athens is the kind of debt that can never be repaid. And the thing that was really striking to me reading this through is this seems to anticipate the way that the tradition millennia later will speak about piety. St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa speaks about the virtue of pietas as doing justice to those to whom we are indebted to such an extent that we can never repay the debt. And Thomas talks about God, country, and parents as the three creditors who we can never fully repay for everything they have given us. And this whole speech in 50 and 51, ending around 51c, Socrates even talks about how it's not pious to do violence to parents. It's not pious to violate the city's commands. And that again is just a striking anticipation of the way that Cicero and then later St. Thomas Aquinas will think about this, that there's a kind of piety that's proper to parents as well as to God and indeed to city in between those two.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, we've been tracking this kind of threefold piety since we've read Homer, right? Because he's not as explicit about it in a philosophical sense. But I think in a lot of ways you see this in Hector, right? Hector is pious towards the gods, towards Troy, and towards his parents. And actually, I think a lot of the tension in the Iliad is what happens if this hierarchy starts to try and pull you in different ways. What if your parents and the polis are contrary? What if the gods are contrary to the interests of the polis? Where do your interests lie? And you can see this too, even in things like Antigone, the play Antigone by Sophocles, with Antigone arguing with Creon about what to do with her brother's body. The polis is under the divine. There's a certain piety that we're supposed to have this. Well, how dare you strike out, little girl, against Creon? I am the king. Yes, but we're both subject to the divine. We have piety, and what's the divine wants to do. So we've had this idea that piety really is an act of gratitude, but it seems very flat in our culture. Like when we talk about someone who's pious, it's like, well, they say their rosary every day. Sometimes pious even can mean like aloof or overly innocent or something like that. But piety here has a very thick understanding of something that even gives political structure, cosmic structure, even structure to the soul. And so, no, I think this threefold piety is incredibly important. And it's played out, I think, very explicitly here. You owe piety to your parents, to the polis, and to the gods, and in that order, in that hierarchy. And I really like this. I mean, I think it's a politics of gratitude. I mean, this is something that's completely foreign and alien to us as modern Americans, right, under our liberal democracy. I mean, we talk about rights. Our entire political language is saturated in rights. I mean, as soon as we wake up, it's, what am I owed? Right. This is what is owed to me. We don't ever talk about like my duty, a duty that blossoms, that is nourished, that is brought forth from my gratitude about what I have received from the polis. I mean, we don't even think about this towards the polis, much less the divine anymore. But that there's something that, and I really like this. I think Cicero plays it out too much. I'm trying not to maybe make this argument overly mature by looking down the line at Cicero and St. Thomas Aquinas. But, there really is a common good. I mean, one way, like a really simple way to look at it is, you're a child. You can't do anything. You cannot take care of yourself. You can't do anything. And yes, you rely on your parents, but your parents rely on society. Right? You're born in a hospital. You participate in a society that has, medicine and food and transportation. You do all these things, and all you're doing is soaking it all in. You have not contributed a single bit towards the common good. And for us, like, we become adults, and that doesn't matter to us at all. We just claim, okay, well, this is what I'm owed, and we invent new rights all the time, and our rights, are antagonistic to one another, and we fight out whose rights are dominant, and this is really where all our political discourse comes from. But the ancients, and particularly think of maybe like Cicero, talk about, you become an adult, and it's like, what can I give back? Like, finally, I've been nourished by the common good of the polis, not to the exclusion of the divine, but just to focus on the polis, right? I've been nourished by the common good of the polis. I've been nourished by my parents. The gods have taken care of me, and now I have capacity And the gratitude I have in my heart is an impetus, an invitation to give back. What great deed can I do? What arete do I have that could give back to Rome? That could give back to Athens? I mean, this is just an insanely alien political thought to us today.
And all of that I think is a true ground for patriotism, which is something that it's a value that you could mention and people will say, oh yeah, of course it's a good thing. But that's the proper ground for it. It says understanding that I owe an unrepayable debt to my country as well as my parents and to God. And the manifestation when I start to act rightly and in a rightly ordered way on that gratitude, on that sense of obligation, then I'm acting in a patriotic manner. And you mentioned, right, the contrast between the ancient view and our contemporary view, and I think a big part of that could be explained by the fact that we conceive of society as something that we have made in some sense. So this is to dip into the political philosophic tradition way forward from Plato and Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the modern social contract theorists, who I mention in part because in the Crito comes strangely close to articulating this, but I think departs in a very important way. The social contract theorists posit that we're all naturally individuals instead of naturally social. And so there's such a thing as a state of nature, which is not political, not social, not civil. And we humans, at some point, individuals get together and create through a social compact. We construct a society by an agreement with one another. And then this new thing exists. The government comes into being out of a bunch of isolated individuals agreeing to make something together, agreeing to construct something together. And if that's the way we imagine that political society works, not just governments, but society itself, the nation itself, which then has a regime, then it's our inferior because it's something we made. And so a tool that I made is a tool for me, and I'm a god in relation to it. And so it's below me. And so of course I ought to think about what it can do for me and not what I can do for my country. I mentioned that though in relation to the Crito because Socrates winds up arguing in the voice of the laws that Socrates, implicitly consented to the laws by being formed by them and then not moving away, right? So the argument is that you have incurred this debt because the laws and the society of Athens raised you and made you who you are in some way. And if you really wanted to get away, you could have. The laws do not prohibit you from moving away and even taking your property with you and just relocating. So you have tacitly consented to the laws being your authority, in addition to the fact that you just owe this debt of gratitude. And so that starts to look like a social contract theory, but I would want to distinguish them at the root. They're radically different in that for Socrates, what comes first is the city standing in position of fatherland to the citizen. It's as a father, and it begins in total dependency and total formation, as you were describing. A child is dependent upon parents and then the broader society, and that seems to be what is primary. You can remove yourself from your country, whether that's actually a just thing to do or not. You're permitted to do it, and then you wouldn't be under its authority anymore. But Socrates has not chosen to do that. And there's a really interesting comment to this effect. This is I'm looking at 52b. Socrates, again, speaking to himself in the voice of the laws. The laws say right at 52b, Socrates, we have great proofs that both we and the city were satisfactory to you. You would never have exceeded all the other Athenians in staying at home in it, unless it had satisfied you exceedingly. You never went out of the city to see the sights, except once to the Isthmus, to the Isthmian Games, nor did you ever go anywhere else except when you were with the army on campaign somewhere, and so on. What's really interesting about that line, so Socrates is a homebody. He doesn't get out much. And the only time he gets out is one time he goes to the Isthmian Games which is a little bit like the Olympic Games. It's a religious festival at the Isthmus of Corinth. And then he serves in the army, and so he goes on campaign and fight. But that he doesn't get out from Athens other than that. But the phrasing that Plato uses here is that you never went out of the city to see the sights, which is epitheorean. So this is theoria is this the verb for seeing or beholding, and it's where we get our word for theory or contemplation. And so the phrasing of this is that you, Socrates, you never went somewhere else to contemplate. Like you didn't travel around. The thing that your own way of life is centered on, contemplation, philosophic contemplation. You thought Athens was adequate for that. And so not just as in the ordinary manner of a man traveling to foreign countries and just having a good time getting to see the sights, but in this, there's an allusion here to Socrates' philosophic activity that the laws are saying to him that you didn't need to go somewhere besides Athens in order to be the philosopher that you were. And so even if we, the laws of Athens, did not directly form you to be a Socratic philosopher, we didn't intend for you to found the tradition of Western philosophy when we were raising you in music and gymnastic. Nevertheless, your own life in becoming a philosopher and doing all of the wonderful things you did in that was conditioned by Athens, and Athens was adequate for that. And so you should be grateful to us, to Athens, not only for your life, not only for your education in the ordinary sense of that, but even perhaps for your development into Socrates, the philosopher, in the way that Plato's readers understand him.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, a couple thoughts or a few thoughts. One, going back to your comments on like John Locke and things like that, and I do have a question kind of when we get to that point, but it seems though that modern liberalism, maybe to put this in this context, in a lot of ways, is the political theory that we can run a polis without piety to the divine, right? Which actually which sounds very normative to us, but it actually would have been an incredibly bold and striking claim at that time, because everyone from Aeschylus to Aquinas believed that for the polis had to be aligned, right? That the soul, maybe it's a little bit much, but the family, the polis, and the divine had to be aligned for there to be true justice in the cosmos, right? And Plato comes in and really adds the soul to that. So you have a soul, you have a family, you have a polis, and you have the divine, and these things have to align for there to be this kind of justice in the cosmos. In a lot of ways, liberalism is an argument that we don't have to have that anymore, that the polis can actually be detached and can somewhat rebel, or even that we can fracture that piety to the divine into a million different pieties and it won't matter. I think that's an interesting way maybe to look at liberalism and its experiment. The other thing that occurs to me too is, again, piety is so odd to us. You think, well, how do problems in piety even cause political problems? And this is what we have to think about the Apology, that he was actually being charged with impiety. He denies the gods, and he invents new ones. And in doing this, he corrupts the youth. I think, again, here, it's hard not to think of Aristophanes' The Clouds. That kind of shows you, like, okay, well, Socrates, that kind of caricature of him over and over again, says, I don't believe in Zeus. I don't believe in Zeus. And what ends up happening? Well, your oaths don't matter anything. Nothing matters. And so what ends up happening? There's chaos. What was the guy's name? Not Strepsiades, his son.
Phidippides.
Yeah, Phidippides. He's like beating his own parents and, beating creditors. So you don't have to pay your debts. You don't have to listen to your parents anymore. And it devolves into chaos. Why? Because there's no piety. It's that piety towards the divine that kind of holds everything together. You almost think of another example would be guest friendship, maybe, in Homer. How does guest friendship even work? Why do guest and host have these vulnerabilities towards each other? Well, one reason is that, the stick there is Zeus. That if one of these parties violates this, remember when Menelaus, I think, goes against Paris the first time in the Iliad, he cries out to Zeus, like, let me win, to show what happens to guests who violate guest friendship, right? I mean, absconding with your host's wife is typically a negative, right? Let me show what happens to a man who does this. So I think that, I'm reminded of this, particularly this is at like 51a or so. He's talking about all the different ways, because he said there's a line in here that it's repeated over and over again. You will destroy us.
Yeah.
Right. If you escape Socrates, you will destroy us. And that was something on this read through that really caught my attention. Like, well, how? And I think that's a good question, right? How will this destroy the polis? And I think thinking back to the clouds is one good example. that if you have this impiety, even towards the polis, in that people see that impiety, like, oh, look, Socrates can run away. Because think about, like, play this out, right? Socrates can run away when he thinks Athens is being unjust to him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, great. What do you think the next guy's going to think? What do you think all the people think that get sentenced to death? They all think it's unjust. So now they all can escape. That's the precedent that's set. So I think one thing too here is to think about, like, the precedent that's being set. What would Socrates be teaching the people in the polis if he did this? And how would this kind of deconstruct or destroy the order, the political order that the laws have founded?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One brief comment on liberalism. I think we could do several podcasts on this, but to tie in with that, Thomas Hobbes is quite consistent here. He says that you have absolutely no rights in relation to the sovereign, except when the sovereign tries to kill you, and then you could resist. And there's, like, you're allowed to run away, you're allowed to kill the man who comes to kill you, the executioner, whatever. There is none of this sort of politics of gratitude argument that Socrates is making. So Hobbes has that kind of consistency actually going for him in his own system, playing out the, as you put it, the removal of piety from the political order. In terms of the clouds, I mean, that's one of my favorite ancient Greek texts, actually, and reading it in relation to Plato. I'm so glad you're doing that. It's so illuminating. On the one hand, Socrates has, so the Apology is explicitly answering the accusations of the clouds. But the way in which Socrates answers those accusations in the Apology is a little bit strange. He claims to be the most pious and best citizen because he claims he has this divine mission, and he's actually benefiting the city as much as possible by stinging them out of their slumber. They're the great horse that's asleep, and he's the gadfly stinging them. And he's sort of surprised that they're not thanking him for stinging them all the time. So in a way, he has a response there that he is the best citizen, not the worst citizen. He's not corrupting the youth. He's actually leading them. He's not accused of that by any of the youth or their parents, and he's actually leading them to justice and so on. Nevertheless, the impression one gets in the Apology is that he's angering everyone, and he seems to be in a certain way still embodying the caricature of the clouds, which is to say, he's living a life that Socrates in the Apology admits is incomprehensible to most people. When he says the unexamined life is not worth living for most people, the context of that famous one-liner from the Apology is that, look, if I really explain to you what I'm all about, you're not going to believe me. You're going to think I'm joking or something like that I would actually rather die than shut up. You don't understand me, and I can't make you understand me. The only way I could do that is if you come and live with me for a while and I actually engage in dialogue with you for a long period of time. And so there's still a kind of maybe correction that has to happen in the Crito, which is that when push comes to shove, Socrates will walk the walk. He will, in fact, obey the laws. And the reason I think that argument still needs to be made is because maybe in a sense he is guilty. I mean, corrupting the youth from the standard of Athenian piety, does Socrates believe in the Greek gods in the way in which the ordinary Athenian does? I don't think so. And does Socrates, he sees piety as a virtue. He understands justice as a virtue. He has better arguments for piety and justice and moderation, courage and everything than anyone else in Athens. But he doesn't understand by them the exact same thing as everyone else does. And so does he introduce new gods? He sort of does. He seems to reconceive Zeus or the divine through the forms or the ideas, his doctrine or a theory of the forms. Those seem to be new gods, and that's certainly the way that they're portrayed in the clouds, is that these are the new gods that Socrates is worshiping, and it's not Zeus. And so there's a way in which Socrates is posing a theological challenge to Greece. He's philosophized, and he has come into quarrel with the poets, as we mentioned earlier. And who are the poets? They're not just good storytellers, but they're the bearers of sacred tradition. They're the ones you go to learn about the gods and the heroes. And Socrates has entered into a quarrel with them and said, you don't fully understand what the human is, and don't seem to understand fully what the divine is either. And we need to sort these things out. And so there is a sense in which he is guilty. It's not because he's a bad person or harming the Athenians, but he is shaking them up and he's challenging their authorities precisely because he's seen the flaws in their authorities. And yet he can still walk the walk in the Crito. He can still say, even though I see the flaws in your foundations of your moral vision and your theology and all of that, your mythology and all of that, nevertheless, you made me who I am, and I am infinitely indebted to you, and I am going to submit to your authority. And I'm not going to do so in such a way that betrays my own vocation. I'm not going to censor myself. I'm not going to embrace exile. I'm going to stand as a kind of witness against your flaws, and yet I am still going to drink the hemlock when it comes to it.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, one thing that occurs to me down at like 53A, and you kind of mentioned this too, is hey, why don't you go to Sparta? Why don't you go to Crete? Like you said, those were good governments. Like, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go? And one of the things that you kind of alluded to earlier that I want to pick up here is, and maybe by way of analogy, is to use Leo Strauss, which is probably a terrible idea, because if anyone's more vague and difficult to ascertain than Plato, it's probably Leo Strauss. But
I'm going to shine clear light on this, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm going to sally forth into this anyway and make everyone upset. But one of the things that people always debate with Leo Strauss is that he critiques communism, he critiques fascism, and then at certain points he critiques liberal democracy and liberalism, and then at other points he seems to sing its praises. And there's a lot of questions then about like what is he like? What is his actual ideas about liberalism and democracy and these types of things? It occurs to me that whole conversation is somewhat analogous to what we're seeing here with Socrates. Is like, well, I can tell you what, if I go live under the communists, I'm not a philosopher. And if I go live under the fascists, I'm not going to be able to be a philosopher. Now, I can live under a liberal democracy, and it has lots of problems, but I can be a philosopher, right? I have the freedom, even though that freedom is highly abused and a lot of my citizens are going to become drunk on it and ruin their lives. I can use that freedom to pursue a good life. And it seems like something analogous is going on here of like, well, yeah, I could go to Sparta, I could go to Persia, I could go to the other places, or I could go to the countryside and, a little hideaway hole. But can I philosophize there? Can I be a philosopher? I don't think so. I think I have to give up my life of philosophy. And we saw in the Apology, he won't do that. He won't choose exile if it means the end of the philosophic life. So he stays in Athens, even though Athens has all its problems. It has allowed him. I mean, I guess my point here is like, even though it hasn't proactively nourished the philosophic life, I guess maybe that's overly critical, but it hasn't actually nourished it. And if anything, it's a little bit antagonistic against it. Particularly here at the end, it still has permitted it. And that's actually more than any other political system currently. So therefore, it is the best option of the worst options because it's the only real one we have. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think that's actually somewhat analogous to our current liberal democracy. But that's how I read like why he owes this great debt to Athens. It's not even because Athens understands it as a gift it gave to him. It's just that it allowed him to have a philosophic life to a certain extent.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's wonderful. I'm glad you brought in Strauss. That wasn't where I expected that to go, but that's actually a really great place for that to go with a comment on Strauss. And I'll just keep going in the Straussian direction and mention Al-Farabi, who's the medieval Islamic Platonist philosopher who Strauss was very interested in. There's a passage in one of Al-Farabi's works where he's doing a kind of summary of Plato's Republic, though it's not a strict summary, but he's talking about similar themes. And he talks about certain human types arising in a city like weeds. They're not cultivated and they are seen as obnoxious. But it seems in that passage that Farabi is thinking about sophists and philosophers. And it's hard to sort of have one without the other. And it seems like that's an image for describing what you just described about Socrates in relation to Athens, that he was they weren't trying to engineer Socrates when they set up their education system. In the Republic, in Plato's Republic, Socrates creates an entire city that is ordered towards the production of philosophers, a just order in general, but also philosophers as their kings. And it's very deliberately ordered towards cultivating everything you would need to have the best philosopher kings within it. And that is not Athens. That in no way describes Athens. And yet here, between the lines, as it were, there are allusions that Socrates himself makes that the conditions were there. Not only did Athens permit him, it didn't squash him for 70 years and then it finally killed, which is a pretty good run. Even more than that, it had the sort of cultural conditions and the freedom without being a Spartan military aristocracy that would have not permitted Socrates to spend his leisure time in this way. It permitted it in a certain way, indirectly cultivated him by trying to cultivate its citizens into good Athenian citizens. And so I think that point of yours is very well taken, and I like the comparison to Strauss and contemporary liberal democracy. That at a minimum, the case to be made is that this permits a great deal of diversities of ways of life, and many of those are really disordered. But a few of them are pretty good. And that's also Socrates in Plato's Republic when he talks about democracy. It's the second worst regime. It's right there on the bottom of the ladder, just above tyranny. And yet he says it's an amazingly diverse place that permits all kinds of different souls to emerge and different orders of lives to emerge. And so you can sort of do whatever you want there. And you could even get really serious about virtue and philosophy in such a society. It's not structurally going to help you in the way that you might want, in the way that a more orderly society would direct you towards your good and the common good and the highest good. It will not do that for you, but at least it's not forcing you towards some ideological idol like a communist regime is.
I agree. One thing too that occurs to me, and we mentioned this when we studied the Apology too, is like, to what degree can a polis, a civilization, survive the advent of a Socrates or a Jesus Christ? And if you kind of that can go very many different directions, but to kind of encapsulate it in what we've been talking about here. So you have this threefold piety, and it cascades down, right? So you have the divine polis family. And so if something shifts in the divine, it should shift in the polis. And so if you get someone like Socrates who comes in, denies the gods, and makes strange gods, is talking about the god and the daemon that's been given to him and all these things, you can see very quickly why that becomes so dangerous to the polis. And particularly what's most dangerous is if the guy's right. If it's the individual that's right and the polis is wrong, but the polis would have to restructure to match what's now true. And that restructuring is basically, I guess certain civilizations have done it well, but typically it's brutal. Typically it's a death and a rebirth, right? And so you look at Athens. You can think of like Jerusalem after our Lord. I mean, how many times in John's Gospel does our Lord prophesy that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed? I mean, because when Christ comes, right, the same thing happens. The piety shifts. The piety, how we give piety to the divine, shifts. God is now amongst us. This is what he's telling us. He's updating the covenant. He's perfecting it. We get Sermon on the Mount. I mean, a lot of people are like, I really would have liked to live during Jesus' day. I think I would not have wanted to live. No, I very much
about to pass away.
No, I would not have it. It's too complicated. Like, I don't know where my piety would have fallen. I very much enjoy 2,000 years of saints thinking about these things and handing on. He
said he was bringing a sword. Like, what did you think that meant? Like, he is coming with a sword.
Like, I just don't, maybe the gospel always play it up, but our Lord talks in parables all the time. And I'm like, no, I would not risk it. I love having the Catholic Church telling me this is what dogmatically believe. This is great. I love this. I'll receive it. Right. But the point there is, like, when the individual comes, like Socrates or Christ, that reorients the piety of the divine, and the polis has to shift, that's really dangerous. And that causes these kind of societal restructures. And so it occurs to me then, in that context, why then the polis then can can be so violent towards someone like that. And then you think of, obviously the list of individuals goes on. You think of St. Joan of Arc, you think of St. Thomas More, right? You think of these people, right, that were martyred because, right, they stood up against certain things, and that for the polis to actually say this individual is correct would have admitted that the polis needs to restructure, and the polis doesn't do that. It would rather kill the individual and move on. And so I think what we see here too is that shifting of the piety is difficult, and it can really bring violence, particularly on whoever the prophet is, right, to use that term, that's trying to reorient the city.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely right. Socrates, in a sense, Socrates sets in motion the destruction of the Greek polis. It needs to be refounded because its fundamental concepts at all of these levels, from the divine downwards, are necessarily shifting with this kind of new thing that's happening, which is philosophy, actually philosophizing. And I love to remind my colleagues in theology that the first use of the term theologia is in Plato's Republic. That's the first record we have of that word. And so Plato came up with that, because what precedes it in Hesiod is theogony. It's the generations of the gods, but it's not yet logos about the divine. And Socrates says, in as many words, this is something we need to do, and I don't have all the data, but I'm going to do what I can. So he sort of invents natural theology, and he doesn't have scripture, and he doesn't have revelation, but he conceives of that project of thinking through logically what the God must be, and what his attributes are, and what we could say or could not say about the God. And so, there's a sense in which Socrates comes along and does that to the Greek polis, and there's a sense in which Jesus, what does he do? Does he put the final nail in the coffin of the ancient city, or he does that in a sense for Rome? The peculiar thing about this is I wonder if this means that there has to be a sense in which it was just for Socrates to be executed. And if that's maybe it's a limited sense, but maybe he actually was violating the laws of Athens, even if he has a wonderful justification for his way of life. And then we today are the inheritors of this amazing tradition of political philosophy and of all the kinds of things that Socrates is doing. That was not yet a tradition in his time. That would be a strange conclusion to reach, that it's a both and. It's not that either Socrates or Athens is simply right, but that precisely because Socrates, by being right and while Athens is wrong, Socrates is a threat. And so the city has a kind of obligation to respond to that threat. That would be a very strange and somewhat paradoxical conclusion to reach, but I wonder if we have to go in that direction.
Do you think it's odd that Socrates does not appeal to the divine in this dialogue? What I mean by that is, could he simply not tell Crito, like, my daemon's not checking me? Or could he simply tell Crito, by the way, I mean, he could just borrow arguments from the Apology. I know I can't leave. I have a vocation to Athens. The God has assigned me. I'm the gift, right? I'm God's gift to Athens. So one thing that was really interesting to me here, as I kind of reread it, was Socrates seems to be, I don't want to make it like a secular argument, because that's not the right word, but Socrates could have leaned into the divine much harder in this dialogue, and he doesn't. He seems to really want to convince Crito that you need to stay because of this gratitude towards the polis. The polis has nourished you. And even though it's clear from the dialogue the polis is subject to a piety to the divine, I think that's there. The divine is in the dialogue. It's not nearly, I mean, it's thick in the Apology. And that thickness is not here in Crito. And I wonder why that is.
I think that's right. It is around the edges. So I think the dream, you could think of the dream as something divine, and then at the very end there's this reference to the Corybantes, which maybe we could talk about in a second. But so it's sort of bookending that he makes these quasi quasi-religious, quasi-divine invocations. But the heart of it is absolutely what you said. It's something that's going to be more accessible to Crito and portable. It's something he can take with him, that he doesn't need a Socrates around to have some revelation from the god in order to reason through whether he should obey the laws or not. So in a way, what Socrates is doing is he's giving Crito a private lesson in philosophizing about moral and political duty. And that's the sort of thing that in principle is open to anyone, more so than receiving a private revelation through a daemon or something like that. And so maybe it's just more appropriate. Maybe it's also more Socrates' mainstay in terms of he doesn't frequently or maybe at all introduce premises into his arguments in the course of the dialogues that are revealed premises. He's a philosopher, and so it's. I'm not saying this is rhetoric in the sense of mere rhetoric, but it maybe is rhetorically appropriate for him to do that in front of the 500 jurymen in the apology, that I'm being accused of impiety. Let me answer that with a direct claim to piety through this story of going to the oracle and what it said and so on. And maybe that's the kind of thing that will be more accessible to a huge crowd of Athenians, where he can't take them all step by step through an argument. Again, I don't say that to suggest that that didn't actually happen, that that's not a real story. I don't know about that, but it seems like this is more his ordinary mode of argumentation, and the heart of it is going to be reasoning through. He also says he genuinely wants to persuade Crito based on Crito's own opinions. He doesn't want to just assert something that is going to override Crito's thought. Maybe Crito would actually go along with that, given who he is, but this again seems to be Socrates' strange mode of generosity, which is he's going to try to elevate Crito as much as possible, even if that's kind of challenging for him.
No, I think it's really insightful. I appreciate that. What do you think about the ending? So, like, one of the things that the first time I read it, well, not the first time I read it, but when I read it twice as I was kind of preparing for this and for my Sunday small groups, my Sunday Great Books small group, is at first, like my first read through, I was like, oh yeah, this one doesn't end with a myth. Like, because we kind of get habituated to that when we read Plato. Like there's like a myth at the end. There's like this supernatural justification. So he tends to make these like philosophy arguments. But then at the end, he tends to always like cap it on to like, oh, and by the way, like, here's the myth of or here's, the myth that's in the Gorgias. But actually he does. I noticed on my second reading, right, the laws do at 54b here towards the end, they be persuaded by us who have brought you up, Socrates. Do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness, in order that when you arrive in Hades, you may have all this as your defense before the rulers there. So it's not a full-blown myth, but it is an appeal to the judgment, which is what so many of the myths are trying to explain, right? You think of myth of you think of the Gorgias, like they're extended myths that are very, detailed. But the point there is that being just in this life will be rewarded in the next, right? You're going to be judged. You can't think of your actions just within the temporal, but rather you have to think about them in the spiritual as well. And so it's interesting here that it's actually the laws that then are appealing back to the sacred stories, to the myth, to explain to Socrates why he needs to be just.
Yeah, and you're right to notice that pattern, and that pattern, I think it's most clearly the case in the Gorgias, because he says it explicitly there. But that pattern of Socrates arguing philosophically and then capping it with a myth, which is consonant with the conclusions of the argument. That's what Socrates says explicitly in the Gorgias, that this myth he's going to tell is a speech which reflects the thing that they actually just argued through dialectically, or that he at least concluded dialectically in that work. That there's a kind of he's showing that there's a consonance and there's a memorable story that one can take away from this, which will bring you to the same conclusion. That seems to be the case here as well, that he wants to leave us and Crito with that. So that's all, as you pointed out, that's in the voice of the laws in 54b and c. There's also this final comment that Socrates makes to Crito, or next to final. This is at 54d, having finished speaking in the voice of the laws, Socrates says, "Know well, my dear comrade Crito, that these things are what I seem to hear." These things, this whole speech from the laws, just as the Corybantes seem to hear the flutes. And this echo of these speeches is booming within me and makes me unable to hear the others. Okay, so who are the Corybantes? I've got a note in my edition, which is very helpful. It reads, in connection with worship of the god Cybele, a rite was developed to cure nervousness and hysteria by means of dancing to frenzied music played on the flute and the kettle drum. Participants in this psychiatric exercise were called Corybantes. The present passage suggests that the music echoes, probably with calming effect, in the memory of those who have undergone the cure. And so, to draw out the analogy, the speeches of the laws, which Socrates has just gone through and constructed or retold, are echoing in his own mind and confirming to him. He's able to sort of replay this dialogue that he just had with himself of laws and him, with him trying to argue for the Crito position in fleeing from Athens. And he's able to somehow play that through his head. And so those speeches echo within him as a kind of something he can repeat to himself as a kind of like catechism, a dialectical catechism of here's how I'm going to arrive at these conclusions of the way I ought to act. I've gone through this enough times in my head that it's stuck in my mind, and I can appeal back to it. And yet that's described with reference to the Corybantes, who are worshiping the goddess, and so it's also this kind of liturgical as well as argumentative reference.
That's a wonderful insight. Yeah, I appreciate that as like a cure for nervousness, a cure for anxiety. Like that's really telling, right? Because Socrates, we'll see this in the Phaedo too, which we're going to read next. Everyone else is weeping. Everyone else is like really.
Yes.
Everyone else that's really distraught about Socrates, and the guy that's going to die is like trying to calm everyone down in the room, right? So no, I like that's a wonderful little illusion. I like that a lot. That like, hey, put it in different ways. Like there's a little mantra that's in my head that is keeping me calm. That's keeping me kind of. I think of St. Augustine's, definition of peace is the tranquility of order. Right, my soul is just. I think that too. I mean, I was going to note that maybe not to argue against myself, but the very last sentence of Socrates in 54e, he says, "Let it be then, Crito, and let us act in this way, since this is the way the God is leading us." So here, right at the end, then, my reading of this, taking it very literally, would be that the daemon has not checked him. Right? How does he know that God is leading us this way? Well, we know he doesn't explain it all here, but we've known from other dialogues and his testimony that the daemon checks him. And so here at the end of the dialogue, he realizes the daemon has not checked me. The daemon has not told me I've gone down the wrong path. Therefore, I am going the right way. And so maybe there is that, even though he didn't lean as heavily into it in the apology, the divine is here. The divine is, guiding him in this dialogue.
I think that's right. And again, just to return to the theme of piety and the different objects of it, it's striking that what comes to the forefront here is the laws. It's the laws, the city, the community of the city of Athens that occupies this major place in the conversation. And there's some kind of connection between that and what the God is saying. There's a kind of integration there for Socrates. Although, as you just explained, it's actually the absence of the daimon saying no, but he ends by describing that as divine sanction to his argument.
Yeah, just one last thought for me as I kind of contemplated this dialogue is when I read it in my small group, we had an individual that just died on this hill, that Socrates was not being just. Like Socrates needs to leave, like his family, like just absorbed Crito's argument, like this is right, etc. And like to the degree that like it was really funny, like the small group's done, and I always end at the same time, no matter what. Like the conversation, like we're done at 10. I mean, we start at 6:30 having drinks and charcuterie boards. At 7 we start talking. At 10 this thing's over. People can go home. But if you want to stay and have cigars and pipe and drinks out on the porch, you're fine. Well, this guy afterwards is like walking up to each person being like, you tell me that if your wife was like falsely imprisoned, you're just going to be like, well, I'm pious towards the law and I hope she does okay in there and I'm never getting her out. Right. Like, and like really just in people's face about it. It was really, it matches his character and it worked well. But it also it's good to have someone like that, because we're all just not sitting here nodding along saying Socrates is amazing and not really thinking it through.
Right.
But one of the things that really, but as I kind of thought about his examples throughout the week, one of the things that occurred to me as I thought about it in my own life, like what if I was falsely accused? What if my loved one was falsely accused? How would I do this? What occurred to me is I noticed that Catholics are in an interesting position insofar as Socrates is under the polis and he's making these examples of I have to be pious towards the polis. And if I set this precedent that like, no, I determined the whole polis is unjust and therefore I can act contrary to it. I destroy it because now everyone can do this. It falls apart. It was interesting to me though that, Catholics can claim that we're also citizens and subject to a second polis. And it's the second polis, right? Church, that the perfect society that can actually step in and say, no, actually this civil ruling was actually unjust. And so it's interesting, I think, because you play this out with the saints sometimes, and saints that, have escaped false imprisonment. They have run away. They have done these things. One of the things I was trying to think there is that I think that's one of the distinctions between us and Socrates, just from an infrastructure standpoint, is that we claim to be part of a different group, right? That Socrates didn't have. He didn't have an external body outside of the Athenian political order that could make a claim on him and could rule against Athens, saying, no, this is actually unjust. But we as Catholics have that.
I think that's right. I'm not sure that simplifies things that much, however, because what it means is that we're all potentially in the position of Socrates because we ourselves don't have to be Socrates, but that there is an authority, another society of which we are members, and to which we owe our loyalty, and which is guiding us towards our perfect final end, our otherworldly end, and in that sense is superior to any other society on earth. But what that means is that we're all potentially in the situation of Socrates in the Apology and Crito, and we don't have any right to say I didn't know any better. We don't all have to be philosophers like Socrates. We have to be thoughtful and discerning and obedient to the church. And so in a way that simplifies things. In a way it radicalizes the problem of Socrates and the conflict between the philosopher and the polis, because now we're all ought to be philosophers in the sense of lovers of wisdom, of Sophia, and that is made accessible to us through Mother Church. So we're all in a pickle, like Socrates.
Yeah, it really is a comment on, I think, the architecture or the infrastructure of the problem, not necessarily that it makes it more simple, because as a cleric, I will tell you, not that this is a commentary on the Diocese of Tulsa, because everything's wonderful in my local church and we have no problems.
Wonderful. Good. Congratulations.
But like the church's decisions as an institution are not always just. And you actually can find yourself like Socrates, where it's like, okay, well, now I guess I just simply obey virtue and obedience. Because so you actually run into the exact same problem. It's like, okay, well, if I buck up and decide that I can overrule my superiors, I can overthrow the hierarchy because this is actually unjust. Well, who makes that determination? I do. Well, what about the next guy who makes it, who's wrong? Is it better to be obedient? You actually see, if you want to see a microcosm of, I think, the Socrates dilemma here in a different setting, think of Benedictine monks that are in a monastery that are under a bad abbot. And so like they are obedient to him for the sake of the community existing and surviving, for a certain period of time, but then have to suffer through, his poor leadership, whether it's his weakness or, whatever it is, just being a poor leader. So no, I don't think it doesn't really simplify it, but it does show, like, in certain situations, particularly if it's the political, it's a temporal order. Because I was thinking, like, well, I do believe the church is teaching that an unjust law is no law, and actually that it's not binding on conscience. But the thing is that it's not me that makes that determination. The church that actually steps in and makes that determination, that second and higher polis. But then the higher polis itself could make it a determination that I find is unjust, and I still have to obey that. So it's a different internal structure. Not sure if it simplifies it, but as I was thinking about this problem from a Catholic standpoint, I noticed that aspect.
Yeah, good. Great.
Well, any other, as you kind of look at the end of the Crito here, any other comments or anything we missed or anything you want to emphasize?
Just my very short way of framing apology in Crito is that we should think of the apology. The emphasis there is what Athens owes to Socrates, and the Crito, the emphasis seems to be what Socrates owes to Athens. And so they're a great pair. Obviously, they're part of a trilogy or quartet or all 35 dialogues. They all go together in some way, but they're a nice pair in that sense. And if we keep in mind that complementarity between those emphases, we can, I think, better appreciate the paradoxes of how different Socrates seems to be in the two. He's doing a different kind of work in the two dialogues.
No, very good. I appreciate that. Well, Dr. Papadopoulos, I greatly appreciate you coming back on and guiding us through the Crito. It's always wonderful to speak to you. I appreciate everything that you bring to the podcast and that you bring to our studies here on the great books. Where can people find more about you?
WyomingCatholic.edu. I can't plug my own institution enough. I love the college that I teach at, and it's just doing wonderful things for young people out here, giving them a Catholic classical education in a sort of embodied and incarnational vision of what education ought to be. I'm also on the platform formerly known as Twitter. So if you want my less refined and respectable thoughts, you could always suffer through that if you're needing that.
Yeah, no, very good. All right. Well, again, we appreciate it, everyone, as we kind of move on in our Platonic studies. Next, we'll be reading the Phaedo or the Phaedo. So pick that up. It's a little longer than the other ones that we have read. So get working on it, and we will start discussing it next week. See ya.